pool of... This is where
Matty O.W.
unraveled the mysteries of
AIM training.
This is the birthplace of
AIM.
The microcorrection. Those tiny adjustments made with just small movements of the mouse. These are the true building blocks of aiming that you will see no matter what FPS you are playing. Counter-Strike, Valorant, Overwatch, clicking, tracking, switching. Microcorrections are all there, and being able to perform them properly and seamlessly alongside fast flicks or sweeping movements is what can often define a truly skilled aimer. Here, we will discuss one of the hardest parts of aiming to get right, and showcase one of the most legendary players aim training has ever seen. One of AIM Labs' few World Champion Tournament winners, the best deadlock player in South America, a voltaic coach who pushed boundaries and led the conversation of Tac FPS aiming through innovation. Those of you in the aim training scene know who I'm talking about already. This video is for the one and only Cartoon. What defines a microcorrection? In aiming, we define a microcorrection as generally any short, narrow motion that traverses very little distance on screen. While microcorrections are generally synonymous with microadjustments, I usually like to differentiate these two terms using the category in which they are performed. I like to think that microcorrections are best used to describe short movements in click timing scenarios like static and dynamic clicking. In these scenarios, you're usually performing a micro to close the distance between a target and a larger movement that is error-prone, like a wide flick. As for micro adjustment, you're then performing several micros across a whole run to react to changes in a single target's movement direction to sustain a steady track on it. This way of referring to micros isn't universal, but it's how we will be describing them in this video. Let's begin by discussing the history of micros and how they've become one of the primary focuses of attention in the FPS aiming space. If you search up microcorrection on YouTube, you will actually find a number of videos, mostly surrounding Tac FPS, that focus on this element of aiming. It wasn't always this way though, and the conversation stems from trying to resolve the problems inherent to a far more well-known component of good aim: flicking. Like we've already stated, wide flicks are error-prone. In games, players are often facing situations where the target suddenly appears on their screen, and they have to make a last resort gamble flick movement. This might work sometimes, but it is nowhere near as consistent as we would want it to be. But we still need flicks. They are a crucial element of any aimer's arsenal. We need to be able to instantly speed up and reach our target with our crosshair before they do. A lot of the time, especially in Tac FPS, where the TTK is so low that if we're playing at a sluggish pace and not flicking, we will lose most duels, simply for being too slow. The question then becomes how to find the right balance in flick speed where we are not severely overflicking and losing control of the mouse, but also not falling behind the speed of the opponent. When aim training became popularized from 2019 to 2020, people began to realize just how useful the environment was for trying to find this balance. This includes one of the most famous Valorant players who is partly responsible for bringing aim trainers into the public eye: TenZ. Listen to this video from all the way back in 2021 when he described how to perform a microcorrection instead of simply relying on purely fast flicks.
Trying to react sometimes, like when doing flicks like these, instantly not doing anything, just flicking that way. You can actually take your a little bit of time to do a second micro adjust. So I'm trying to off flick.
Those of you who are fans of my channel and in the aiming community, doesn't this sound extremely familiar to you? This is the Bardaz method. TenZ was describing in his own intuitive way the Bardaz method of flick and then microcorrect.
The idea is to actually make a very fast flick, as fast as you can,
with your arm, and then you will land somewhere close to the dot, possibly even on the dot once you get very good. And then, you have to wait for your brain to realize where you landed, or kind of predict where you're gonna land based on the movement, depending on how good you are. And then microcorrect. Microcorrection means that you're basically flicking again, but on a very, very, very small angle. So it's not really a flick, because it would be just a little movement of the hand. And then you land on the dot. That's the idea.
The major critique I have about his explanation, though, is that he seems to describe microcorrections in a way that makes it seem like you're performing them to deliberately slow down your aim for greater accuracy. Performing microcorrections should not have to make your aim slower. A better way to describe it would be that microcorrections reflect more disciplined flicking technique. Minigod describes it best.
The task on the display presents one target appearing in a limited time window, which means that if we don't perform our aiming motion fast enough, it will simply despawn. Most players will try to approach it in the most instinctive and natural way, which is as displayed, relying heavily on pure reaction time with no discipline involved. This means our aiming motions are not performed as consistently as they could with correct reflex aiming habits. Now let's take a look at what a more healthy approach to reflex looks like. The differing factor is that instead of relying on fast reactions alone, we are taking a brief moment to visually process where we have to perform our flick or microcorrection. This does not mean that we are making our aiming slower. It's just that we are enforcing the idea of being disciplined with the way we react, which allows us to have clear vision of where our shots has to be connected.
Micros need to not be seen as slow. If you are intentionally slowing down your aim because you've been convinced that micros are meant to be slow, you've been misinformed. They should be performed rather swiftly, but like Bartos says, it's not really a flick either. That's why the best definition for a micro is a short, smooth movement. That's the key distinction between a flick. Smoothness. Flicks don't really need to be smooth. They're supposed to be snappy, rigid, and explosive, performed with tension located in the upper muscle groups like the arm and shoulder to quickly cover a really wide distance. Micros, on the other hand, are meant to be performed with lower muscle groups like your fingertips or your wrist if you're on low sends. This helps to minimize the amount of possible wasted motion you have at the ends of your faster movements. Smoothness also helps a lot with perception, and the best way to explain this is by switching over to the category of tracking. Let's use Overwatch's Soldier 76 as the primary example. Consider the aiming style of the old NYXL Overwatch League Pro, Flower. What do you think stands out the most here? What you might immediately notice by envisioning yourself in Flower's shoes is that it is pretty difficult to actually see what is happening in this clip. I'm sure a number of my Overwatch viewers might remember that his tracking technique looked especially messy. This is how lack of smoothness in your micros can negatively impact your overall gameplay. Flower is effectively stacking or chaining multiple disjoint micro adjustments one after another to maximize any time on target possible at the expense of visual clarity. We've actually hit this idea before in the much older episode on Snowy. Back in that video, we described how Snowy intentionally withheld tension in his wrist for wide flicks, allowing for incredibly smooth decelerations. What I didn't mention was the gear that Snowy was using. He used the Zenconic M1K, a much older fingertip grip mouse, on mostly high sensitivities. Why is this worth pointing out? Well, consider how Snowy performs micros and recoveries in tracking. He is exceptionally smooth, which results in a crystal clear view of the target and its shorter strafes. This smoothness comes from using the right muscle group for micros, your fingertips. Especially when on a higher sensitivity, it's critical to perform these shorter movements with your lower muscle groups to avoid falling into the habit of over-aiming. And this is when we repeatedly perform more movements than we need to when tracking a target, leading to the same wasteful technique that is seen when performing the Bartos method with messy flick landings. Now that we understand the conversation surrounding micros and how they're meant to be used, what's the best way to train them? Well, if you're just looking for a good list of scenarios, look no further than the king of micros, Cartoon, and his Kovac page. Many of the scenarios in this listing mostly fall under a newer aiming subcategory known as linear clicking. This aiming subset isn't necessarily new, but it was recently separated from overall dynamic clicking due to its specific features of easy readability and a focus on timing. We can find really old VODs of Cartoon pushing scenarios such as these, most notably floating heads timing. This is easily Cartoon's signature scenario, but what exactly makes it so great for training microcorrections compared to something like static clicking? Compared to other popular dynamic variants, floating heads does play like static, but the difference is in how you must approach the flick landing. Because the targets are moving very slowly and predictably, you need to keep your fingers rather loose to make extremely tiny adjustments. Noting this, it is much harder to rely purely on the accuracy of the initial flick to hit the shot, and the distance of the required microcorrection is usually more extended and therefore visible in this scenario. The extra attention delegated to ensuring the accuracy of the smaller movements helps to isolate them and improve them more directly. This is the motivation behind VBR, or vibration clicking scenarios. VBR scenarios are designed like static clicking, but the targets move or vibrate ever so slightly. This subtle motion is often enough to throw off the accuracy of the flick landing and force you to perform a micro. This extra layer has proven to be helpful in improving this area of your aim, which is why it was included in the Season 3 AimLab static clicking benchmark scenarios for novice and intermediate ranks. But it's not just VBR types that help with this. Any clicking scenario with very slow movement or very predictable movement will actually be quite good. These are the Cartoon scenarios, all of which target narrow angle motion and clicking micros. A lot of useful scenarios like these can be found simply by searching ETH in Kovacs, ETH, which abbreviates the creator Ethereal, who specializes in building linear clicking, micro, and Tac FPS focused scenarios. Almost every one of these scenarios has been dominated by Cartoon over the past few years. Starting out, Cartoon was always a clicking player, but when the AimLab's 50k tournaments came around, he knew that he needed to extend his skill set into tracking in order to keep up with the competition. Remarkably, Cartoon stands out as one of the few static mains to successfully branch out into tracking, and it makes perfect sense. Like we stated earlier, stabilizing our narrow movements with tension in our fingertips lends itself to better smoothness and clearer perception of the target. Cartoon understood this, and he first made the connection from static to linear and dynamic clicking scenarios. The key, however, to unlocking tracking came with this scenario, Erangelic 4 Voltaic. The power of Erangelic comes with the fact that it is a hybrid between precise and reactive. It asks for smooth, efficient micro adjustments in sync with quick movement reading. Since his micros were already strong, Cartoon simply needed to build comfort with movement reading, which didn't take long because, like any air variant, Erangelic puts you against very diverse patterns. Since half of the equation was already done, his improvement in these micro-focused tracking scenarios was blisteringly fast compared to his static clicking peers. Honing his tracking ability enabled him to win the third AimLabs 10k Skills Challenge, crowning him an AimLabs World Champion, one of only maybe 3, maybe 4 people who have ever won an aim training tournament for that title. Expressing the maximum amount of skill with micros can be considered conditional. What do I mean by this? Well, when we look at this aspect of aim training, a lot of attention is placed on engaging the fingertips and having such a fine tension balance with your lower muscle groups that even the tiniest of movements remains smooth and stable. However, the trend over the past few years has moved away from meeting that skill demand. Mouse sensitivity is at the center of this conversation. As aim training evolved, preferred sensitivity ranges started to trend towards the slower range. This is where the idea of sensitivity cheesing comes from, because at the end of the day, top aim trainers like Bulldog, Europe, and Draco simply wanted those high scores, and low sensitivity alleviates the difficulty of balancing out tension in your fingertips. Performing micros with your upper muscle groups is just easier. And this adds a new layer of impressiveness to an aim training score. On scenarios like Clover Raw Control, Erangelic, or really any clicking scenario, generally it is more impressive when someone gets a score on a high sensitivity instead of a low sensitivity. The conversation extends to mousepads too. Skypads are considered faster, more freeing, and relatively harder to use than even the firmer cloth pads. So the question now becomes, Who in their right mind would subject themselves to the painful grind of high sensitivity skypad micro scenarios just to prove it can be done? Yeah, who else but Cartoon? In basically every scenario that you see him, Cartoon will be running a sensitivity that is a decent bit faster than the average on the leaderboard, and he will be keeping up with or even surpassing players who are running at double his CM per 360. It really is impressive, and it fits him so well as one of the first pioneers of the community who led the scene with his own decisions, defying the trend towards slower sensitivities and demonstrating that the skill of aiming had so much more depth in it that remains unexplored. Micros are present in aiming situations in all games, but you will most definitely need them to be strong in Tac FPS games like Valorant, R6, and Counter-Strike. With proper crosshair placement, many gunfights simply boil down to who has the faster, more concise microcorrections. We've already discussed the aiming fundamentals required for Tac FPS in this video about linear clicking. Please check it out via the link in the description. Though we have broken down these topics at length on this channel, due to how relevant Cartoon is to this environment and how pivotal his work has been in improving the Tac FPS scene, we can't go without highlighting the impact of the coaching he and others in Voltaic Amped have provided. Specifically, we're talking about the Voltaic Aim Lab's Valorant benchmarks, featuring scenario variants that have been used to coach a large roster of professional Valorant players, including major tournament winners like Jing and Ye. Cartoon working with both of these players was a pivotal milestone in the development of the aim training scene and its importance in the FPS genre. A lot of the scenarios he used set a standard for Valorant aim coaching that remains relevant today. Look how micro-focused these tasks are. This responds to the kind of aim training that most Valorant players jump to at the surface of aim training, fast, flashy flicking scenarios, much like how TENS gravitated to Gridshot back in 2020. The problem is that those faster-paced, wide-angle scenarios aren't what you're actually facing in Valorant, like we mentioned earlier. This is why the Valorant benchmarks play the way they do. Players who struggle with maintaining efficient micros, which includes me, will also naturally find these scenarios challenging, but that's why they continue to be so profoundly useful. If you're watching this video and you're looking to get better aim in any of the Tac FPS games, please be open to trying out these tougher, more niche scenarios, especially the micro-control tracking ones that enforce smooth micro technique and fingertip usage. Don't take it from me, I'm an Overwatch player. Take it from the king of micros, Cartoon, and the amazingly talented pros that he has coached at the top of the Valorant competitive scene. This has been the 7th episode of Unraveling the Secrets of Aim. Sorry for the very long delay between this and the last episode. I've decided that I want to give this series a proper finale, since my college graduation is coming up and I will soon be on to the next big chapter of my life. Stay tuned for the next couple episodes. I promise it won't be as long of a wait. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, happy dot clicking.